The men and women who serve in the Navy come from everywhere in America. From my very first days in the Navy, I served with young people from rural areas in the heartland, inner city, and everywhere in between. So it's a cross-section of America brought together. And then the other side is the desire to serve.
They're 18, 19, 20 years old, right out of high school, going out and keeping the ships running, keeping the ships safe. We're putting weapons in their hands and they're protecting you.
You know, it's not uncommon for, a 20-something sailor to be driving a few $100 million warship around, and, he's barely old enough to have a driver's license.
If I would have enlisted at 18 or 19 years old, I'm sure I would have struggled. It's a really big ask for people at that age to come in and assume as much responsibility as we want them to. And they're not fully formed, right? They're still growing.
They're not just showing up ready for war, we're still raising a lot of them. And I think a lot of times we as senior people forget that they're not just coming in as robots that we can program to go do a job. We also have to invest in them as young people who are growing as adults.
There are some shocking moments for folks the first time they realize that, hey, I'm not gonna have 24/7 access to email and communicate and FaceTime with my family members. That can be kind of startling at first.
You don't have the go-tos, and so what do? Because shipboard life is pretty difficult. A lot of folks have, mental health issues kind of unmasked while they're out there.
Then the Navy is understaffed chronically, which means that people are being asked to do at least at the limits and maybe a little bit beyond the limits of what human beings can actually do.
Yes, there's definitely a warrior spirit where people don't want to acknowledge. There might even be a sense of denial in the fact that they are too fatigued to stand a safe watch because they want to get the job done.
Everybody is trying to do their best. I think we have to be reminded sometimes that, fatigue will make cowards of us all.
Anyone at any point in their lifetime could have difficulty adjusting to a new situation. The Navy is an entirely different culture. We have our own language. We have more structure and discipline and authoritarianism than many people have experienced at home. So it makes sense that adjustment problems are the #1 issue people have in the military, regardless of where they're assigned.
Well, for an enlisted crew, you essentially have about a 3-foot by 3-foot by 6-foot box to live in. That is your personal space.
When I was underway, it's about 350 plus personnel on a 510-foot vessel. So what does that mean? That means that you really don't have time to yourself.
It can be a little overwhelming, the lack of any real space or privacy. So your real privacy on the ship becomes your rack, the place you sleep, right? One curtain separating you from everyone else, and that's it.
In most cases, people berth with folks who work in their division or department, so that necessarily means that there are almost constantly people coming in and out to go to meals, go to bed, wake up, try to clean the place.
If they're on watch in the middle of the night and their alarm goes off, it needs to be loud enough for them to hear it, but you're probably sleeping a couple feet away from them, so you hear it too.
Is your mattress comfortable enough to sleep? Depends on how tall you are and how heavy you are.
My youngest brother, who just left the Navy, was 6'6", so it was pretty hard for him to curl up into that rack. So on some ships, you can't even roll over, right? Your arm will get caught, so you have to get out and get back in if you want to be on your back versus your chest.
Triple bunk, you get maybe 2 feet, maybe 18 inches of airspace, which I think would be difficult for me. The second is hot bunking. Do you know what hot bunking is? You get into a warm bed because it's warm from the body that was in it beforehand.
At the same time, it's also very noisy. The berthing area that I slept in was toward the aft end of the ship, so you always heard the propellers turning, you heard the rudder cycling back and forth. You learn to live in a space with a lot of noise 24/7.
Well, I think the best way to describe it, as someone described it to me, is you're living and working in an industrial environment. Whether it's in the engine room or even in the Combat Information Center or on the bridge, you have to be able to perhaps filter out the noise, you might say, literally and figuratively. Usually when the noise stops, that's the sign of trouble.
In fact, I can recall once when we lost power and our chief engineer jumped out of his rack and yelled, "That's the sound of silence," and ran to the engine room because we're so used to hearing the noises of the ship that when it's quiet, you don't realize just how much noise there is on a regular basis.
trying to sleep and hearing a loudspeaker announcement come on every 30 minutes. And then 30 minutes later, right? 30 minutes later, and each time you wake up.
And then how many days you have to stay on board for duty and stay on board 24 hours. On the smaller ships like the littoral combat ships, they can have duty every 3 or 4 days. You're sleeping on board the ship 24 hours. Again, that's a childcare issue. That's financial issue. Stress.
The GAO has done a study and found that in many settings, not just at the Fitzgerald and McCain, they are not getting enough sleep. So then we put in the NDAA, they've got to get 7 to 7.5 hours of sleep. It's not happening. They're averaging 5 and 5.5 hours of sleep.
The scientifically accepted standard is 7 to 9 hours of sleep a day. The current policies do have allotments for that amount of sleep, especially in response to the challenges that occurred with the Fitzgerald and the McCain. People have self-reported generally about 5 to 6 hours a night.
It seems about 6 hours, maybe a little less. And that's what our research at NHRC shows, as well as the collaboration with Surface Fleet and looking at their float safety climate survey. Most people need 7 or more hours of sleep per 24-hour span of time. And anytime we're not getting that, then we're carrying that little bit of that deficit with us, again, the following day and the day after that.
Can you really toughen up against fatigue and prolong physical and psychological stress?
No, you can't. I mean, that's actually a very simple answer. You can't. There are situations where you may have to operate on little to no sleep. That's part of the job. The idea that you can train your body to overcome that, that's not correct.
It's never recovered. So they're carrying that chronic or accumulation of sleep loss across time, which does put them at risk of a fatigue-related incident or accident.
Let's start with loss of situational awareness. Because you're fatigued, because your mind is clouded, you may not be aware of all of the inputs that are coming into you. You may become fixated.
There's a phenomenon called cognitive tunneling, where you kind of get the blinders on and you're just trying to focus on your little silo, your little piece. And with stress, it's really hard to remember to do that communication and say, look, here's what I'm looking at. Talk to somebody else. They might have another piece of the puzzle.
The second thing is your response times slow down. So if you are in an emergency situation and you need to act quickly, you just don't have that reaction time that you do when you're fully alert and aware and fully rested.
Reduction in reaction time, but we also see increased numbers of misses. Something will pop up on the screen and they'll miss seeing it.
You get into a zone where you experience wake state instability. And what that means is you have lapses of attention and you become impulsive. So what do both of those things mean? A lapse of attention is your brain is here, it's working, it's fine, I'm attending, and then it's gone. And it's gone for half a second or longer, and then it's back again. And during that time when your brain is not processing information, any environmental cues you will miss.
It can appear to be a long period of time of vigilance, and then suddenly something occurs, an emergent situation occurs, whether it's on the ship, whether it's a ship emergency or a vessel in distress, and you need to react very quickly. And that's where this idea of ensuring that you're well rested to the point where you are able to think and respond and exercise good judgment is so important.
We certainly know that we train like we fight, so we prepare for endurance problems, but we know that sleep itself can have a long-term impact in terms of the ability to maintain alertness and function appropriately for operational conditions.
I remember very specifically a few weeks we were out at sea straight, getting calls routinely throughout the night, every night. And there was one day when an officer was on watch, and I went up, it was the middle of the day, and he was talking to me about something that he clearly thought we had talked about before. And at the end of his statement, I said, I have no idea what you're talking about. And apparently we had had this full conversation the night before, and I had no idea. That was kind of a wake-up call, right? To have zero recollection of a fairly important conversation as the guy in charge of the ship.
We do tend to drive ourselves into accomplishing what's before us today without a thought of having a reservoir for what if we were to go to war. We do know that if you go into it already exhausted from accomplishing your day-to-day administrative tasks, that it's unlikely your endurance is going to outlast that of the enemy. But the day-to-day experience of each of the humans that's out there who are extraordinarily focused on getting stuff done, accomplishing mission as they see it, is if I just spend a little more time, I can get one more thing done. And that's true, but we have to continually lend the perspective that during that period, you're much less effective. And it's not just for yourself, it's for the crew. And it's not just for this thing that you're accomplishing, but it's for the safety of the ship at sea.
One of the things that you're really looking for with fatigue management is how do you increase that mental capacity? You know that's going to narrow as you get into situations, right? That ability to prioritize in a tactical situation, how you're going to employ the different weapon systems and sensors that you have at your disposal. All those things are things that you want to have the maximum mental capacity to really approach that problem and that problem set.
We do know that shift work, so working around the clock and maybe sleeping at different times, creates some level of insufficiency. So in operational environments, certainly we have round-the-clock needs. And so with that, understanding that that system is there and how to increase it where necessary or even suppress it when you want to try to grab sleep at the wrong time of day is some of our options.
Shift work is unavoidable. What the science indicates is that it is better to stay on the same schedule than to be constantly shifting. And if you have to shift, giving them some stability so they cover the night for a couple weeks instead of just 2-3 days or even a week will help in offset some of that sleep disruption because you're naturally going to adapt to a new schedule. Your circadian clock will try and adapt to that schedule. But the more you have to change your schedule, the more it's constantly trying to adapt. So less frequent shift rotations is number one.
And I learned that during Operation Iraqi Freedom. I was serving on a destroyer squadron staff, and the Commodore, my boss, mandated that we did circadian watch bills. I was getting less sleep per night from an hourly perspective, but because I was getting the same sleep each night, the same hours, I was sleeping better than I had been in previous. And that was the aha moment for me. So when I had the opportunity as a commanding officer to implement circadian watch bills, I did.
My second ship was LCS-2, a littoral combat ship, the Independence, where we focused a lot on sleep. And we talked about this circadian rhythm, and it worked incredibly well. It was kind of shift work, where the middle of the day was always an opportunity for everyone to come together, and it drove us to be more efficient, but we were no less and arguably much more effective. And it's critical that you have leadership on your ship that facilitates that recognizes how important it is.
And it took some effort to get past that momentum tradition. My experience from my first days in the Navy were sort of the traditional model where the watch bills rotated each night. And I think some of that was based on a perception of fairness. You didn't want one set of sailors always having to stay on the mid-watch every night. But what we've learned is that's terrible from a sleep perspective.
There are some ships where I know even today they may not be affording that same opportunity. It manifests itself in all kinds of ways. People exercise less frequently, what they're eating goes down, their consumption of energy drinks go up. It's all certainly related.
It's not just sleep, it's the interplay of all these factors that contribute to someone's ability to perform their job safely and keep them healthy. And while sleep is important, so is nutrition, and so is exercise and getting activity. It's being a human 101.
You leave it up to a junior sailor. The breakfast of champions is a monster and a cigarette, if they eat breakfast. Lunch may be cheeseburger and fries and an energy drink, which is poison. And then for dinner, it may be Buffalo Wild Wings and beer with their buddies. And so there's not a vegetable or fruit to be found in the entire week. And so if they don't understand how that impacts their ability to withstand the stress on board the ship, the stress is going to be what it is. But you are not going to withstand any of this if you're not eating properly.
The ship hasn't had an underway replenishment or pulled into port and received stores for the past few weeks. You'll notice the fresh fruits and fresh vegetables dwindle. It gets replaced by canned foods, and if you wait long enough, you're eating heated up chicken and rice.
We can't neglect other aspects of human health and performance. We have to consider the whole picture when it comes to readiness. So it's the whole package. And so I think what we bring to the table is this integrative approach of we're not just going to study sleep in its own silo. It's just one piece of a much larger picture. And I look to the Army's performance triad, which is sleep, nutrition, and exercise, right? Those are the pillars of human performance. That's tough because we are working with this cultural mindset of, sleep is not as important as other things. In fact, if you're foregoing sleep in the name of getting more work done and trying to advance in your career, it's often rewarded.
We do have that warrior mindset, and we do have some old school folks that still believe that if you're asking for help, you're just trying to get out of work. So that runs through every sailor's mind. We're afraid that our leaders will lose confidence in us, that they'll have less trust in us. We'll view ourselves as weak, and we think others will view us as weak.
We are sailors and we're strong and we do embrace the suck. And even though it's tough, we're gonna make it through. This thing that's been around since World War II, can-do attitude. With not having the resources I need, I still have that can-do attitude, I'm gonna do it. But when you make that kind of a standard operational tempo, that can be difficult for people, almost impossible to keep up long-term.
You want someone who, despite their fatigue, will say like, hey, put me in, I'm ready to go. But as the leadership of that sailor, you need to say, hey, no, it's time to take a knee. You want people who want to have the ball with 3 seconds left, but need to get held back a little bit by the people who are their supervisors.
It's funny you say that because I had one of my best department heads when I was in a maintenance phase. He hadn't left the ship in 20 days. Unfortunately, I didn't catch it until much later in the process, but I had to sit him down. I had to talk to him and say, hey, this is not sustainable. What are you doing? You're one of my best guys. If we're not careful, that's where folks are going to lose trust. That's where folks think that this is just a grinder. And the Navy doesn't really have the ability to develop and really grow people in the right way.
Even more importantly, what people don't understand is that being understressed can be just as bad for you. If you take a young person who raised their hand and volunteered to go do hard things on behalf of their country, and you assign them to duties that they don't feel are meaningful, don't feel purposeful, and they don't get any sort of validation for having done a good job at that, the resilience begins to erode.
I think I saw it the most with my junior sailors, where they'd gone to boot camp and now they're out forward deployed on this ship, and they're told to go and stand watch, to go and get qualified, to do this and that. And sometimes the higher mission of what we're doing and why we're doing it is a little bit lost. And so that can lead to a lot of frustration.
If they can't connect that to the larger mission that we're doing in a day in and day out basis, then sometimes it is hard. It is hard to figure out what is that sense of purpose kind of going forward. So you got to challenge yourself to be able to connect the dots sometimes in leadership for some of your junior personnel that might not understand why that matters. Answer, it matters a lot because it's a cumulative effect.
The drill sergeant on TV is not going to cut it today in the military. That's not how you train service members. You have to treat them with respect and dignity and, recognize that they are not cogs in a wheel, they are human beings.
When we look at resilience, we talk about a person's ability to persevere, adapt, and grow through the challenges they face. Some of that is based on skill building within the individual, but some of that's based on changing the culture and building an environment around that individual that also helps them to cope.
In the surface Navy, unfortunately, it was the tragedy of the sailors lost at sea from the collisions. And sometimes that's what it takes to say, hey, we need to do something different here. Sailors that were involved in the collisions were reporting fatigue, stress, depression, anxiety, and inability to take the time for themselves to get mental health care, and also not having access to go. Now, we actively seek them out. Our mental health providers are walking on board those ships, meeting with the senior leaders, asking them, how can I help? Teaching classes to the officers, to the enlisted, giving them resources and tools, and if nothing else, giving them a point of contact. You may not need me right now, but when you do, here's my number and email, call. You don't have to wing it. You don't have to figure it out yourself. You don't have to risk making a bad decision.
True leadership is encouraging people to explore that. Like, you might be down and out. You absolutely should go talk to this person to deal with whatever's troubling you. And then you got to ask yourself how you're tougher tomorrow than you were today. And how are you working towards that goal?
You have to be in that conversation so that they don't lose heart. And if the Navy or leadership in that Navy doesn't recognize the struggle and the things that you're potentially going through and how that's impacting you, then you're gonna have greater issues with mental health and concerns. I need you to get that sense of resilience back.
Resilience is not something that can be given. It's something that has to be developed over time. So the training that we have to do to support resilience is not just for the individual, but it's also leadership training. Within the expanded operational stress control program, there's training to help with psychological first aid, and there are feedback mechanisms to help leaders better detect and understand what are the patterns of resilience within their organization so that they can intervene appropriately in areas of the organization where maybe resilience is on the decline so that they can buff that up before a problem occurs.
How are you going to bring out the best in your young people? How are you going to continue raising them, but also upholding those standards to make sure we are the best Navy on the planet? So not a conversation about here's how the shrink wants you to coddle sailors more and give them more hugs, but how do you lead in the way that motivates them and inspires them to be their best without breaking their spirit and causing unnecessary mental health challenges?
As a leader invests in resilience training for their people, they're demonstrating care so that people can be better able to manage the stresses that they're going to be under. Inherently, doing the work we need people to do is stressful. What we owe them is the proper preparation to do that.
A really useful way to think about leadership is to think of the leader as the architect of those conditions. What conditions are you putting in place for the kind of interaction, communication, trust, reliance on people, willingness to listen to what people have to say? What have you done to put in place the right conditions for that team to be able to be successful in this pretty hostile, pretty high stress environment?
And also teaching sailors that self-discipline, that internal locus of control. When you're in a combat zone, you may have to self-soothe. There won't be your favorite teddy bear. There won't be your mom that you can call right away. There may not be anyone who has the time or bandwidth to sit and listen to you, even though you need to talk. That just may not be a fact of life when the bullets are flying, when you're worried about being killed, right? And so now you have no choice but to find out, how tough am I? And so hopefully by teaching these resiliency classes, these warrior toughness classes, it's planting a seed so that when it has to kick in, the sailor has that muscle memory. I can do this, I have to do this, I have no choice but to do this.
Stoics have some similar sentiments, right? You don't get a diamond without putting carbon under a whole lot of pressure. To really become a stronger warrior, a tougher person, you need to overcome some adversity to know what you're capable of.
At all levels, we're coaches. Whether you're a deck plate leader with one person junior to you that needs coaching, or whether you're a captain who is coaching their direct reports, everybody needs that. So continue to see ourselves not as just people who are focused on the mission and accomplishing the mission, but really focused on developing those people who need to accomplish the mission.
We have a lot of work to do, and we turn over our sailors every 3 years or so. A lot of people get out. So we're in the adult education business of how we think about fatigue and sleep, as well as nutrition and physical performance. So taking that not for granted, but for an opportunity and action is very important in this world.
All these things are not in isolation. They definitely interact, and we have to provide that training and that awareness that you have to treat the whole human and not just part of the human.
And I want you to know that you can do it, that you're tougher than you thought, that you can count on yourself, that you're going to get through this and surprise yourself and be really proud at the end. It's not just the Navy's going to take care of you when you need us, but you can do it too. And I want everyone to walk out of the Navy with that, because you're not going to be in the Navy forever, right? I'm not giving you skills to be a better sailor. I want you to be a better person.